All right, welcome back. Once again, I'm your instructor, Vernon Creviston, and we're picking up here kind of where we left off in our intro video for chapter one. We're going to start looking at what existed here in North America before Native Americans ran into Europeans. We're going to look a little bit about how Native Americans came to be here in the Western Hemisphere, what happened to them while they were here on their own before they ran into other parts of the world's population. And of course, we're going to look at how their societies developed, what made them so unique that Europeans, when they looked at them, said, that's not what we call civilization. So we're going to kind of go through that in this series of videos. Maybe one or two components here to this. I'm not sure if we're going to have one long video or if we'll have a couple of shorter ones. So we'll just kind of see how we're progressing through things as we go through it, all right? So let's go ahead and get started here. Now, let's talk about these Native Americans and how they came to be in the Western Hemisphere. So the first thing I kind of want you to think about is this is still something that's evolving. We don't know everything about those original groups of people that came and settled in the Western Hemisphere. The one thing we can tell you is that there are no people that originated in this area. Okay, all human beings came from parts of Africa and emigrated and migrated out of that to the rest of the world. So eventually, during this process of settling the globe, human beings, as we know them today, eventually started making their way to the Western Hemisphere. Now, when I was a student reading that textbook that I talked about in the last video, we thought that happened about 10, 15,000 years ago. But there are news stories coming out every day. Archaeologists and other groups are doing incredible work all the time that continually push that number backwards, right? At this point, we're fairly certain that Native Americans existed in the Western Hemisphere at least 30,000 years ago, probably closer to 40 or 50,000. Right? So somewhere during that long ago period, before the last ice age even started, human beings started moving across from what today we call Siberia, right, Eastern Asia, into what is now the Western United States or North America. And then they moved throughout the entire hemisphere. This happened over a series of waves of migration. It didn't happen with just one or two people doing this. Constantly over these 20, 30,000 years of migration, this happens over and over again where different groups of people come in. It means that eventually, as people settle throughout the Western Hemisphere, they're going to become quite diversified, very different from each other. They're not all from the same exact stock, right? So there'll be some different facial characteristics, different genomes, right? Different genetic markers in them throughout this area of the Western Hemisphere. And of course, this is going to be one of the things that kind of comes to complicate interactions between Europeans and Native Americans. As these groups of people move throughout this entire huge hemisphere, right, North America and South America, there was lots of room. And they didn't have to have a lot of contact with each other. They'd have some, don't get me wrong, but they didn't have to have a lot of contact or continuous contact, if you will, which meant there could be a lot of differentiation here, right? This tribe could live essentially in the same general way as another tribe just a few miles away, and yet they'd have different languages. When Europeans start exploring the Western Hemisphere in the early 1500s, they cataloged at least 375 different languages just on the eastern borders of the Western Hemisphere, right? In places like Brazil, North America, parts of Central America. To put this another way, when Spanish colonizers got to California in the 17th and 18th centuries, they found hundreds of Native American communities that spoke over 50 different languages, essentially between San Francisco and Monterey. So these are groups of people that speak different languages. They have slightly different customs. They see the world in slightly different ways. And that's very confusing to Europeans when they run into them. They look at a group of people that all essentially are doing the same thing, but see themselves as very different groups of people. And it was just easier to kind of lump them together for Europeans, right? It's hard to learn 375 different languages. What's easier? Forcing them to learn yours. So again, right, one of the things we want to do in these early lectures is understand why this process takes place, how it takes place, and what are the ramifications of it. And one of the things we can say is as Native Americans came over to the Western Hemisphere, started filling it up, building things, doing things, they became different from each other. They saw each other as different. And those differences mean it's going to be harder for them to work together. It's going to be harder for them to see Europeans as a threat when they see each other as a threat on a more normal basis, if you will. They have rivalries, they have competitions between these different population groups. So it allows Europeans to exploit a lot of these things. And again, because they're so varied, Europeans are going to look at Native Americans and say, it's easier for you to become me than for me to become you. And because they just felt that their way was superior. Europeans thought that they were the civilized ones. And these groups of people that did things differently, that didn't make a lot of sense to Europeans, weren't civilized. But the one thing that I was trying to point out in our introduction video for this chapter is that they were incredibly successful and they did have their own versions of civilization, right? Before Europeans ever got here, we estimate that there had to be at least 50, maybe 70 million people, maybe as many as 100 million living in the Western Hemisphere. Somewhere between 5 and 10 million in North America alone. So Native Americans, as people transferred over from the Eastern Hemisphere to the Western Hemisphere tens of thousands of years ago, actually were very, very successful. They were good at filling up the continent, they were good at utilizing its resources, and they were especially good at kind of thriving, right, in this new environment for the human race. So even though if Europeans just kind of discount Native Americans, we should understand that they were actually very successful, that they were actually catching up and sometimes even passing what Europeans and people in Asia were doing and Africa were doing at about the same time. And that's kind of what I want to kind of go through and explain some of these differences. What allowed Native Americans to catch up to Europeans pretty quickly, considering that they were kind of isolated for a long period of time. Because the one thing we do want to keep in mind is once Native Americans came over here, once people migrated from Asia to North America and the rest of the Western Hemisphere, by the end of the last ice age, about 10, 12,000 years ago, that migratory path, right, this path between Siberia and what is today Alaska, that people could move along a coastline or maybe even walk over, that's gone. Right? Once the big glaciers and the polar caps start retreating, the sea levels rise. We think that basically the Channel Islands were mountains when people first got here to the Western Hemisphere, to California as we know it today. So you could have walked from Los Angeles to Catalina Island, 20, 30 miles, right, and stayed dry during that entire time, an area that is now ocean. So there are big changes that have come along, and because those changes came, because the ice age ended and the sea levels rose, it meant these groups of people that have been migrating for tens of thousands of years were now kind of cut off from the rest of the world, right? And in those 10, 15,000 years that they're by themselves, they're going to do a lot, and that's kind of what we're going to look at here in this lecture today, right? So one of the things we want to look at is what made Native Americans so successful. Why were they able to kind of get here and thrive in the Western Hemisphere and actually start catching up to different groups of people in the other parts of the world that could actually share a lot of information? If you think about it, right, a lot of information flows from Africa to Asia to Europe and back and forth and back and forth. Native Americans didn't have that, right? They just had whatever they brought with them and whatever they developed new. They didn't get ideas from other groups of people that were living in other different places. They essentially had one database to work from. But one of the things that helps explain why they were able to thrive so well, right, and grow so quickly and fill this continent up, so to speak, is the fact that they were found foodstuffs just like everybody in the entire world did. We think farming started around 12, 15,000 years ago in the what is today the Middle East, right? But it's probably older than that. And Native Americans, when they got here to the Western Hemisphere, started realizing that there were different foods that existed here in the Western Hemisphere than existed anywhere else. And that is going to be a bit of a game changer, if you will, right? One of the crops that Native Americans are going to find and they're going to cultivate and spread throughout the entire Western Hemisphere is what we today call corn, right? And I want you to kind of stop and think about it for a minute. Why is corn a big deal? Why would that be a determining factor here on how successful these people are going to be? Why they're going to be able to have big population centers? Why they're going to be able to take a few thousands of people that migrated over here and turn them into millions, possibly 100 million people? Well, stop and think about it. What's good about corn, right? Stop for a minute and ask yourself that. Why is corn valuable? What makes it a good product? So some things to think about. It's versatile. If you stop for a moment and kind of analyze this, corn could be turned into a meal that you can make cakes out of, right? Like cornbreads. It can be stored for long periods of time if you dry it out. If you boil it, it's nutritious. It has a lot of carbohydrates in it. So it's a very filling food. It's a versatile food, and it's easy to grow. Think about what Fresno State does every summer, how many ears of corn they sell to the public. It tastes good, it's relatively healthy, and it provides a lot of energy. And you can grow it over and over again in a fairly short period of time when you're talking about crops. So the fact is, these Native Americans, when they get here to the Western Hemisphere and start kind of filling it up and start exploring it, they find things like corn. And not just corn. They find things like squash, peppers, tomatoes, avocados, different types of legumes, beans, right? Think about what a diet that's like full of these things is like for you. If every day you were eating corn, squash, peppers, tomatoes, avocados, and beans, you'd actually be pretty healthy, right? You'd be living a very good lifestyle. You're getting good proteins, you're getting good nutrients, you're getting good vitamins. You're having a pretty healthy lifestyle. And that's important, right? It's going to allow Native Americans to build these big, complex societies relatively quickly, considering that they're kind of starting behind everybody else. While agriculture is developing in the Middle East around 12, 15,000 years ago, well, people are still migrating here to North America at that time. But around 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, agriculture starts here in the Western Hemisphere in what we today kind of call central Mexico, right? Right below Mexico City. In those valleys, they get plenty of rain, it's a good soil, and they have a lot of these foodstuffs that they start growing there. And it allows these complex societies to grow. It allows this information, these seeds to travel. And pretty soon people are growing corn throughout the entire Western Hemisphere and growing these other crops wherever possible as well. And of course, that means some big things here. So think about this. The fact that Native Americans have tomatoes and people in Europe don't means Christopher Columbus, an Italian, never had food that we today consider Italian. Who did? Native Americans, right? So this world that Native Americans are creating is going to be incredibly important to other parts of the world. It's going to come to redefine what it means to be European, why European populations are going to be able to grow big, right? Another way to look at this is around 1300 or so, right? Native American populations are absolutely thriving. There's maybe as many as 1 million people living in the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, at the time. What's happening in European countries' capitals at that moment? A thing called the Black Death. Somewhere between a quarter to a half of Europe's population is being wiped out in 1347. In 1347, the populations in the Americas are exploding because they have access to these foodstuffs. They're living an incredibly healthy lifestyle. Now, that doesn't mean they don't have issues. It doesn't mean people don't get sick. They do. But they're not getting swept by plagues like the Europeans are. They're not dealing with all these, biological attacks on them because they're isolated. All the diseases they brought with them, these Native Americans have basically grown immune to, or they're very lessened in their virulence, right? It doesn't kill them the way it used to tens of thousands of years ago, in part because of this really good diet they have. And of course, that's going to allow their populations to explode. It's going to allow them to develop pretty complex societies. And of course, because they're talking to each other, maybe not on a constant basis, this stuff's able to kind of transmit itself throughout the Americas, throughout the Western Hemisphere. What starts as farming in central Mexico, all the way at the bottom of this map, within 300 or 500 years is happening everywhere you can grow corn, right? Wherever these crops can be grown. Native Americans are adapting. They're utilizing the resources that they find just like people everywhere. In short, they're civilized, right? They're transmitting information. They're not necessarily always working together, but they are trading with each other, and information is flowing between these different groups of people. Now, one of the first groups we're going to talk about, and I'm not going to go into much detail here. There aren't going to be a lot of questions on exams about this, but just something for you to kind of think about contextually, right? To kind of keep in mind what's going on here. One of the first groups of Native Americans that we can call a civilization, right? A distinct group of people acting in a distinct way that actually has a definable writing system that helped develop agriculture in the Western Hemisphere is a group called the Olmecs in what is today central Mexico. That was about 2,000, 3,000 years ago is when the Olmecs existed. And they were a very complex society, as I said. They were able to do great things. If you stop and look at this picture in the lower right-hand corner, that's a work of art that was actually kind of a boundary marker for the Olmecs. It's a way for them to say, hey, this is our territory. We run this spot, right? And that stone that's in a man's head, in the shape of a man's head, is a work of art, but it's also huge, right? It's about 6 feet high, weighs several tons. So the fact that they're able to make these things, move them around to where they want them, right, shows just how sophisticated they were, how successful they were as a group of people. And of course, they're just one of the first ones to really get going. One of the most famous that we all probably have heard of is a group called the Mayans, right? They're also in central Mexico, but on what we call the Yucatan Peninsula, that part of Mexico that kind of juts out into the Caribbean. Throughout that area, this group of people called the Mayans created a variety of different, what we today call city-states, right? They had individual leaders, small regional empires, if you will. There was never a Mayan empire in a reasonable definition of that. But a group of people called the Mayans for thousands of years lived in that area. And after the Olmecs were gone, they took some of that information from the Olmecs and they built something new, something definable as their own, right? They were experts in mathematics. They actually came up with the concept of zero, having a number to represent nothing. In medicine, they did amazing things like brain surgery. We actually have skulls from Mayan grave sites that show that people had holes drilled in their head. They lived afterwards because the holes sealed up. They did things like astronomy. Well, before Europeans even really understood what was out there, before Galileo starts finding Jupiter's moons, Mayans had already been plotting these things. They were able to see them in the night sky, and they kept track of them, used them in part of their religious orders, right? So Native Americans are doing amazing things. And if you look at this picture at the bottom of the slide, the buildings that they're creating actually are very similar to us, to what we have today. This building at a place called Chichen Itza, one of these big Mayan complexes, cities during the height of their civilization, about 1,200 years ago. That's an observatory, right? That's where they plotted the course of the moon, the course of the planets, different stars. They were doing a lot of the same things that Europeans would be doing several hundred years later, right? So these Native Americans are very sophisticated. They're able to do really amazing things if you stop and think about it. Another group that was incredibly successful in virtually the same area as the Olmecs and the Mayans is the Aztecs. They came along after these other two groups, and they created an empire, right? What we would today call an empire. They used military force to do it. They went out and conquered other tribes and told those groups, you're now under our control. One of the ways they did kind of enforce this, of course, was what's shown here in the lower left-hand corner of the slide, and that is human sacrifice. They would go out, conquer groups of people, bring some of those captives back to their temples in their main cities, and execute them. partly for religious purposes to thank their gods for victory, but also kind of as a message to the people they just conquered. If you don't listen to us, if you don't follow us, we can do this to you, right? So again, that's a pretty rough thing to talk about, but people are doing the same, well, not the same things, but doing similar things throughout the world. At about the same time the Aztecs are conquering their neighbors, you have people in Europe conquering each other, wiping out whole towns, right? Because they're the enemy. So in the end, Native Americans are doing virtually the same thing Europeans are, but they're just going about it a different way, right? Their modes of conduct are a little bit different, right? Again, they're performing human sacrifices where Europeans might just put everybody to death in a town, right? The same exact end result is happening here. It's just they're getting to that point by different ways. But one of the things to kind of keep in mind here is that these Native American societies were quite successful. The city of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, was a massive complex, if you will, right? It was a virtual city, right? Just like anything we would see today. As a matter of fact, the Aztecs used what we would kind of call a grid pattern to lay out their city, right? Most European cities didn't look like this 500-600 years ago. They had just various pathways going in all kinds of different directions. But the Aztecs kind of laid things out. They grew things out logically, if you will. So again, you can see in some ways Native Americans were actually ahead of different groups of people, especially Europeans. And yet when Europeans look at them, they say, you're not the civilized one. There's something, you're not doing things right. Even though this picture of Tenochtitlan that I'm showing you is actually done by Spanish conquistadores, right? Soldiers that are with Hernan Cortez, the leader of this expedition that's going to destroy the Aztec Empire. When they stop and see this city in the distance, they're amazed at what they see. They know there has to be at least 250,000 people living there, which is way more than the populations of places like Paris or London at the time. And they're going to marvel at it, these Spanish soldiers. They're going to look at how amazing this city is, and then they're going to march in there and take the place over and tear down a lot of these structures to reinvent it, to rebuild it in an image that they see as the right way. So it's just kind of some of the themes here that we're talking about in this first chapter, right? Native Americans are successful, they're civilized, they're doing all the things you're supposed to be doing, and yet Europeans are going to look at it, sometimes be amazed at what they see, and then just discount it and move on. And that's kind of the theme that we're looking at here. And of course, the ones I mentioned aren't the only ones. You have groups like the Inca down in South America, and what is today places like Peru and Bolivia, right? They're doing something very similar to the Aztecs, going out conquering other groups of Native Americans and making them part of their empire, building cities all over the place in the highlands of Peru and Bolivia. They're exceptionally great craftsmen. Idol I showed you at the first video was made by an Inca goldsmith. So there's a lot of creativity going on here, a lot of diversity in these civilizations. But if you're the Europeans, if you're the Spanish that come into these areas, you look at them and you go, they're all kind of the same to you. Whether it be an Aztec, a Mayan, or an Inca, you treat them the same because you can, because it's easier to do that. You discount their civilization pretty readily because it allows you to do the things that you want to do, take over, gain this wealth, increase your power in the world. That is a theme we're going to come to over and over again in the next couple of chapters. Now, moving a little bit closer to home here, right? For Native American societies in North America, they're not going to be able to build as big, complex societies as existed in like central Mexico. The growing seasons are shorter. There may be too little water, too much water as you get into parts of North America. So they have to get to be kind of smaller units, if you will. But still, they're going to be able to do some pretty amazing things. What we today call the Pueblo Indians in America's Southwest, they build things like I showed you that Huacapure, right? These big apartment complexes, or Mesa Verde in Colorado, these big complexes of masonry where hundreds of Native Americans would live for hundreds of years, actually, from about 500 AD to about 1300 AD. These civilizations thrived in what we today call the Southwest, farming, uh, going out hunting some animals, living in comparative peace with each other, although there's always going to be conflict between different groups of people. But for the most part, they were pretty successful, living in one area, having defined territories. And yet, when Native Americans run into Europeans, Europeans are just going to come in and say, none of this counts, this isn't your land, we're taking it over. It's kind of a theme that we'll come back to over and over again. And again, to show you, even though things are different in North America than they are kind of in Central America or South America, they're still doing a lot of the same things, these Native Americans, right? In the Ohio, Mississippi valleys, because they don't have these big stone deposits that they can build these massive cities like the Aztecs and the Mayans can, they work in earth and wood, right? But they still make things that last, just like places like Tenochtitlan or Chichen Itza. The mound cultures built this thing. This picture in the lower right is actually a picture of a snake. And it's about 15, 20 feet high now, hundreds of years after it's built. And that means it was probably about double the size when it was first created, right? Or at least probably about double the height. So maybe around 15, 20 feet high, about a quarter of a mile long, all told, of a snake eating an egg. So they're able, even in North America where it's colder, it's harder to farm, right? You have more space. Even there, Native Americans were able to do some pretty amazing things. One of the most successful of these groups that we call the mound cultures is in a place that is today kind of near St. Louis, Missouri. It's called Cahokia. That city had a population in its heyday about 900 AD, so about 1,200 years ago. It had a population of about 30,000, we estimate. And it's laid out very similar to the way the Aztecs were doing things, right? You have kind of a central plaza area where you kind of do your administrative, social gatherings, and then you have homes in the outlying area surrounded by farming in that area. So again, Native Americans are kind of living exactly like we do today if you stop and think about it. There's kind of the governmental business center, then there's residential, then there's kind of the food producing regions. Tenochtitlan was set up that way, Cahokia was. These are things that are very similar to what we do today. Europeans are going to look at it, be marveled, and then say, tear it down and replace it with what we know. These artist renderings of Cahokia show you what it might have looked like at its time. Again, they're building pyramids sort of like what the Mayans and the Aztecs are doing, only they're doing it in earth because it's easier. It's a supply of a material that they have ready access to. There just aren't any big stone deposits for them to use. Another group that we're going to come to a couple times over the next few weeks here that I want to speak about as far as Native Americans and their ability to do things is a group called the Iroquois, right? Now, technically, there is no such thing as an Iroquois, right? The Iroquois name is a name given to a group of tribes working together. It is located in what is today Upper New York, right, around the Great Lakes region between the United States and Canada's border today. And these 5 different tribes had originally been groups of Native Americans that settled in that region and competed with each other for resources and territory, right? But eventually, they were able to work out a series of treaties with each other, what eventually would be called the Great Law of Peace between them. The Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca originally were all competitors, but they realized that actually they had a lot more in common with each other than they did with other neighboring tribes. So they decided, since land was at a premium, it's hard to grow up there, they're small-scale farmers. That means that they live in smaller groups. They're not building big, huge cities like Tenochtitlan that have somewhere between 250,000 and 1 million people in them. The area just can't support that kind of population. So they live in much smaller units, small kind of extended family groups, maybe 50, 300 people in a village, maybe at most 1,000. So it's very important to them that they be able to have enough land to grow food to support their groups of people. The growing season is way shorter in North America than it is in Central or South America. They need to move around a lot to be able to hunt and supplement that food supply. So territory is very important to them. Well, of course, it's important to other neighboring tribes as well. And eventually what these 5 tribes decided was it would be better for us to define our area, say this is ours, and work together to keep other groups out from taking it from us. And they did. They created a council. It's not really a national government the way we would understand it. These different tribes are all independent of each other, but they work together. They have a way of coordinating. So in a real way, it's kind of a confederation is what we would call it in kind of our governmental terms today. Each of these tribes sends representatives. They come together in a great council. They make decisions, and then they go back to their tribes and kind of ratify those decisions, right? And one of the big things that this great council would do is if one tribe, say the Seneca, was being attacked by some neighboring tribe, they could go to the other tribes and say, hey, we need help. Come and help us defend our territory. And the understanding is that someday the Mohawk might be the ones that are in trouble, and then the Seneca would come and help them. So stop and think about that for a minute, right? Here's a group of people. They have a unique language. They have defined territories. They have a system of government that's working for them, right? They're actually going to be incredibly successful. The Iroquois are still there today in a limited sense, right? And especially in Canada, they have big reservations of that land that they controlled 1,000 years ago. And yet, when Europeans run into them, Europeans will keep saying that this is not a civilized group of people. It is just remarkable how that keeps happening all the way, right? All the way up until my textbook in the 1980s. Another group that we'll talk a little bit about in the future weeks is a group called the Cherokee. They're kind of similar to the Iroquois in that the Cherokee are a group of smaller tribes working together, one identifiable unit though, right? So they have one language between these different tribes. They settle along rivers. Again, they have to kind of farm part of the year but move around to supplement their food supplies to keep going, but they have small kind of family villages, extended families, maybe a few hundred people living along these rivers, but they're organized to protect each other, right? Again, when one village comes under attack, the rest of the Cherokee Nation will come to its defense. So they're going to be incredibly successful. They're going to hold on to their territory for several hundred years as Europeans move in, but eventually they, just like the Iroquois, just like the Aztecs and everybody else, will be kind of dispossessed, forced out of their area and told that they're just not powerful enough, right? That they're not civilized, that they need to leave and get out of the way for another group of people. So a very similar story being told over and over and over again. Now I think what we're going to do is go through this next part a little bit quicker and kind of wrap this up in one video instead of multiple videos for you, okay? So to kind of move into how these Native Americans lived, especially groups like the Cherokee or the Iroquois, let's kind of take a look at their lifestyles, if you will, right? So one of the things we could kind of say, one of the things we did say that you kind of need to be civilized is have some kind of, customs, mores, right? Religious ceremonies, whatever they might be. Well, Native Americans absolutely had that, right? So while Europeans are going to say, hey, we're civilized because we believe in God and we have these religious practices, well, Native Americans could have said and did say the same exact thing, right? But their religion kind of revolved around their day-to-day activities, their day-to-day life, especially to producing food that the community needed to survive on, right? So the Native Americans practiced a type of religion that we today call animism, right? Which means giving kind of the natural world, things that happen like the wind, rivers, flooding, different animals and plants, a kind of a supernatural spiritual aspect, right? So that the wind when it blows, if it's an east wind and it's particularly strong, they would say that there's a spirit that's making it blow stronger than it did yesterday. If it rains too much, they would say there's a spirit, there's some kind of motivational force there that's making it rain more this year than it did last year, making it rain less this year than last year, right? So again, they kind of add these supernatural aspects to things. They could say that this particular rock is important, right? That it's a defining feature of the land and give it some kind of supernatural aspect. And one of the things that Native society kind of did, especially in North America, is it gave a lot of authority to people who seemed to have a connection to that spirit world, right? If you were particularly good at swimming, they said they would think you have some kind of connection to that spirit that's in that water. And because of that, we're going to put you in charge of things that have to do with that water, right? So if you're particularly good at swimming, maybe you'll be the one that teaches the kids how to swim. If you're particularly good at fishing, you'll be the one that teaches how to fish. And if you stop and think about it, that's a merit system, right? They're actually doing a merit system like what we do today. If you're the best at something, we're going to pay you to go do that, right? Well, Native Americans are doing the same thing. So again, Native Americans are actually kind of ahead of the curve here, right? They're living a lot more like what we do today than Europeans were. And yet when Europeans run into them, this is going to be all too confusing for them, right? They can't tell who the religious leader is because there's one guy that seems to be kind of in charge of religion, but then there's a whole bunch of other people that are in charge of other things, right? And Europeans, it seems so chaotic to them that it's easier if they just kind of either ignore the leadership of the tribes and just push them out of the way, or they only deal with one tribal member and say, okay, you're the leader. You're the one we're going to make a deal with. When to the natives, they're going, hey, look, that's not the guy that's in charge of that, right? You can't talk to him. He can't make deals for us. That's not his job. So again, it's very chaotic for outsiders. But for Native Americans, this helped kind of explain your place in the community. If you're the good fisherman, that was what you did, right? If you were good at making baskets, that's what you did. If you were good at hunting, that's what you did. And you helped others become good at it as well. Because after all, everybody needs to be successful here in order for the tribe, the group, to succeed as well, right? Which brings us to maybe the area where Native Americans and Europeans had their biggest differences in some ways, right? And that, of course, is the idea of land ownership. Now, again, as I've been kind of describing with Native Americans, because they need the land to produce food to survive, it was their most critical resource. They'd be willing to go to war to defend it, and everybody had a part in making the land produce for them, right? Men would go out and clear forest land so that women could come in and grow the food, and then the men would come in and harvest it, right? So they broke up a lot of the workload between them, the different members of the community, and their villages, their groups were built around these lands that they held. But because everybody depended on these lands, on the food produced by them, it meant that the land was not owned by any one individual. It was owned by that tribe. This area, this tribe. That area, that tribe, right? Maybe they're all part of one big giant unit like the Cherokee or the Iroquois, or maybe they're independent, small, tiny little tribes that just have a few, 50, 60 square mile area that's their own. But they own this stuff as a community. Now, don't get me wrong, they do have personal wealth, right? They might own their own homes, they might own the items in the homes, but anything that produced for the community was belonging to the community, right? So you may have your own home, may have your own utensils, work tools, weapons, what have you, but everybody was expected to kind of do their part. Everybody was expected to help produce for the community on their land from their natural resources. Those were given to everybody, and it was everybody's responsibility. Now, contrast that with what Europeans are doing, and even people in Africa and Asia, right? They often would have Europeans especially, have this ideal of individual ownership, that this is mine and nobody else's, and everything I get off of this land belongs to me. That's completely foreign idea to Native Americans, but it was how European society worked. And it's why when Europeans come over and they want to get land, they don't understand why the Native Americans say, well, sure, you can use this land, we're not using it right now. But that didn't mean the Native Americans were giving it away permanently. They were just saying, hey, you can use that land to grow food there, but you'll have to share it with us because we're letting you use the land, right? So again, that's going to cause a lot of conflict. For Europeans, this system just doesn't make sense. There's no record keeping. There's no deeds and titles, all the things that we have today that tells us this is mine, right? Native Americans don't have. And it's not just that that's kind of confusing to Europeans when they run into Native Americans. It's also the way Native American society is structured. There are social classes, especially in places like the Mayans, the Incas, and the Aztecs, Uh, but in North America, it's very hard to tell who was wealthy and who wasn't, right? Because they didn't think about things that way. There wasn't a big emphasis on material wealth in North American tribes. So leadership's fluid, and everybody kind of dresses the same. Everybody lives in about the same size buildings, right? You couldn't guarantee that because some family member was a leader that their children would be leaders. Very often, again, the merit system is what mattered to Native Americans. We need to survive. We need the people that are best suited to help us survive in charge. And if you can't do it, just because your dad was in charge doesn't mean, or your mom was in charge, doesn't mean we're going to leave you in charge if you can't get the job done. We'll find somebody else. So again, it is not always about family connections, right? It's not generational like in Europe or even Asia, where just because the grandson of a king is automatically a king, or the granddaughter of a king or a queen is automatically a king or a queen or a princess. To Native Americans, that doesn't make a lot of sense because that doesn't help the community survive at all, right? You need to prove your worth in that society. And of course, another thing is that these communities were based around family. So there was kind of an internal hierarchy, if you will, right? The oldest members of the family were the ones that were kind of in charge, and everybody kind of gave them the respect that their age kind of entitled them to, and they listened to them for advice and kind of went about things in that way. Very different than what Europeans are doing. Now, one thing I do kind of want to dispossess you of is I kind of speak about this as almost an idyllic system, right? And in some ways, it actually was. It worked very well for a lot of Native Americans. But obviously, they're human beings like anybody else, and they're going to have conflict. They're going to fight over each other. As I was mentioning with the Iroquois, one of the reasons they created the Iroquois Nation, these group of 5 tribes working together, was to actually fend off other tribes, conquer other tribes if they needed to, take more territory from other groups if they needed to. So there is conflict. There are wars from Native Americans, but they're different. One of the things to kind of keep in mind is that when Native Americans went to war with each other, it wasn't just to wipe each other out because they prayed differently or spoke differently. That was kind of the norm, right? They all spoke a slightly different dialect or a different language entirely, had different customs. What made them fight was often for the resources. We need that land to grow food, we need that river to get fish, right? Whatever it might be. But in the end, most of the time their wars, even for the Aztecs, wasn't about the human sacrifices. It was really about controlling the resources. So tribes would conquer other tribes and slowly but surely bring those tribes in and make them a part of themselves. Very different than what we might see in Europeans, right? One story in the mid 17th century during the English Civil Wars, right? One religious leader, a person by the name of Oliver Cromwell, that we'll talk about in a few chapters. He's the head of England's government at the time. And part of their empire, Ireland, is in rebellion. Oliver Cromwell takes an army from England over to Ireland and utterly destroys 2 Irish towns to tell the Irish people, you can't rebel. He puts every man, woman, and child in these 2 villages, Wexford and Drogheda, to death. He gave them a chance to surrender. They didn't surrender. So when he conquers the cities, he just kills everybody there. Native Americans aren't doing anything like that, right? There's more of there's purpose behind both of these things. But for Native Americans, it isn't about destroying your enemy. It's about kind of controlling your enemy. For a lot of Europeans, it's about destroy the enemy, get them out of the way. Then what's theirs is yours. And these 2 very different ways of looking at the world are about to come crashing into each other, right? Now, one of the last things I want to talk about here with these Native Americans is something else that's going to become very confusing for Europeans when they find Native Americans. And that is the fact that Native Americans have a different social structure entirely. Their gender relations are incredibly different than what Europeans are used to. First of all, especially in North America, a lot of tribal leadership goes through the mother, right? Because you could always tell exactly who your mother was, right? She gave birth to you. That is definable. You didn't always know who your father was. because women chose who their partners were. And if a woman said, hey, look, I'm not happy with you anymore, that guy had to get out and leave. Essentially a divorce, right? So women had a lot of power. They're the ones that actually owned the homes. The men didn't. The men owned their own tools, their weaponry, right, clothing. But women owned the kind of the day-to-day mundane features of life, the baskets, the cookware, all of that, the clothing and the blankets. Those are all owned by the women. They often had a big say on what the society did, what the tribe did, because their input was absolutely critical. Who's going out growing a lot of the community's food? Women are, right? Who's helping harvest it and cook it? Women are. Who gets to decide if we're actually going to war? Well, sure, men are going to do the fighting in this society, but by the same token, women, because they're going to have to feed those troops, they're going to have to be the ones holding down the community when the men are away fighting. They could say, no, we're not doing it. And they could essentially veto going to war. So think about kind of that as well, right? When Europeans run into Native Americans. Here are Native American women that actually own the home. They're the ones that the men seem to be looking to for leadership sometimes. The women seem to be in charge. The women are out working in the fields. Europeans can't make sense of that. Can you think about those stories, things that you should have read in the textbook about women in Europe at this time, right, in the 15th and 16th centuries? Women don't get to tell their husbands, I want a divorce. Even if their husband's cheating on them, doing horrible things, they can't divorce their husbands. It's just not allowed. They have to just accept whatever's happening to them, right? Women could be sold off by their parents in European culture to help further the family gain. Can't happen in a Native American society. The woman gets to decide who her sexual partner is, who she's going to be married to, right? So it's amazing. If you stop and think about it, once again, Native Americans are living much more like what we expect to be normal today. And yet when Europeans run into them, they're going to say, this is all wrong. It makes no sense to us. That just isn't the way things should be. But yet, some Europeans could recognize this system worked. This picture here on this slide is done by Protestant settlers in the northeastern part of what is today the United States, right in the New England colonies. This guy's name is Roger Williams. He's one of these Puritans that comes over to set up these religious communities in the New World. And when he goes out and meets these Native Americans, he realizes something. Yeah, they're doing things different, right? Back home in Europe, women don't go out and work in the fields. That's men's work, right? But he does realize it works for them. These Native Americans have a system that works. He said in one of his journals that there are no beggars among them. And stop and think about what he means there. What does it mean to be a beggar? What is somebody that begs for things, right? Let's think about that for a second. In our society, if somebody's a beggar, it means it's somebody that doesn't have food, doesn't have shelter, maybe doesn't have any way to do those things. They're disabled, something on those lines, right? But Roger Williams is saying they just don't have it. There's nobody like that in their communities. They take care of each other. Their system is successful. And yet, Roger Williams is going to be one of the few Europeans that are going to acknowledge this. For the most part, Europeans are going to look at this and say, these men are lazy. They clear the land and then they make their women grow the food while they go off and hunt and fish and have a fun time. Well, to Europeans, hunting and fishing is a recreation. But to Native Americans, it's absolutely essential for their food supply. So the men are clearing the land, getting it ready for cultivation, then going and supplementing that food that the women are going to grow on that land with other foodstuffs. Once again, working together. But to Europeans, it just seems chaotic. It seems wrong. And the opposite is true here as well. Sometimes Native Americans are going to go to Europe. One group of Native Americans that goes to Paris, France, they go to the capital. They go to the King of France, and they see his palace. They see all the foods that Europeans have. They see these huge cities that Europeans are making. And what the Native Americans noticed was something that was obvious to almost everybody in Europe, but they never talked about. Native Americans said, "We noticed among us some men gorged to the full." Excuse me. "We noticed among us some men gorged to the full with things of every sort. So if you were rich, you had all the food you could possibly want. While their other halves, poor people, were beggars at their doors, emaciated with hunger and poverty." To Native Americans, this made no sense. Here are your people, they're starving, and you, who have everything, give nothing. And yet, Europeans are going to look at Native Americans and say, "You're the ones that aren't civilized. You're not doing things the right way." Today, we would say what Europeans are doing 500 years ago was incredibly wrong, right? We wouldn't allow that to happen, at least on the scale that it was happening during that time. So, what I kind of want to think about here as we wrap this up is this. If we didn't know what's about to happen, right, after Europeans and Native Americans come crashing together, I want you to think about which one do you think is the more successful society? Which one is actually more civilized to you? Europeans who fight constantly with each other, wipe each other out sometimes, have these rigid hierarchies that allow some to have everything and others to have nothing? Or Native Americans who try to give as much freedom as possible to different groups of their society that seem to be pretty successful with limited personal wealth, with limited resources in some cases, but seem to be thriving in this new world, right? Which one would you have thought was going to do better here? Which one would you think is actually going to survive this encounter? Honestly, we would have said the Native Americans. If you stop and think back to any of the early stories we remember from our grade school days of first, second, third grade, right? The Pilgrims only survived because Native Americans helped them. The settlers at Jamestown only survived because they were able to get resources from the Native Americans. So on its surface, you would have thought, well, these Native Americans really have it going on, and they're going to be able to control this situation. And yet, the exact opposite happens. And that's kind of what we need to get into in the next chapter, is why are Europeans going to be able to discount Native Americans so completely and push them out of the way so efficiently? It doesn't look like it should be that easy. So kind of in a recap here, right? What we kind of want to remember going forward, especially in this part of what's going to eventually become the eastern portion of North America. Native American society is very different than what Europeans are expecting and used to, right? Land's owned by the community, not individuals. Makes it hard to get land from Native Americans because they don't understand that concept of ownership, of self-ownership, right? Women in Native American societies have a lot of different roles to play and have a lot more authority than women do in European societies at the time, right? Which is also going to be confusing for Europeans. It's going to make it easier for them to say this group of people's uncivilized, right? They're lazy, they don't know what they're doing, and we really need to show them the right way to do things. But also keep in mind, and this will be important going forward, it's not a paradise in and of itself here in North America. There is conflict, there is war. Native Americans see each other sometimes as the potential threat. These Europeans that are showing up in small numbers at first, dying from starvation, don't seem like much of a threat when the neighboring tribe has hundreds of people that they could come and try and take your land from you. So those issues, those differences between Native Americans are going to have huge consequences down the road. And it's going to allow Europeans, who are sometimes outnumbered, really be able to kind of control the situation and take advantage of that division between Native American tribes and exploit them for their own benefits. All right, we're going to leave it there. That's it for you today, right? I gave you enough to think about in these two videos, and we'll pick it up from there in our next video on Chapter 2. Thank you.